is we seem to go through land reform bills every 10 years or so. Was this needed, and is it going to achieve what it set out to achieve? Let's start with Andy on that.
Right, we have a land reform bill every 10 years or so, but it's also worth reminding the committee, of course, that land reform is a very broad topic. So non-domestic rates, housing, rent controls, wildlife control, deer management, that's all land reform. And so, in fact, Parliament deals with quite a lot of land reform legislation, although it may not badge it as such. No, this bill won't achieve what it sets out to do, other than in the Part 2 provisions, which expressly make changes to the 1991 tenancy agreements for farmers and introduce a new tenancy regime, a refreshed tenancy regime for smallholders. Otherwise, depending on what, this is my main concern. The government appears to wish to introduce a bill that it has said will greatly empower communities and diversify land ownership. In fact, that's been the language that's been around for 25 years of devolution. But this bill will expressly not do that. Yeah.
Peter, I'm working along the table, so Magnus, I'll come to you last. So, Peter.
Okay. The short answer to your question is yes, it's needed. But no, it won't meet the objectives that are being set out for it. But I want to try and give that some context. You said this was a kind of warm-up question, so I'm going to limber up for a moment or two, if I can, with you.
Not on the whole bill, and not for the whole
I'm just
session.
going to try and put this into a context, if I can. And I want to go back, actually, to sort of just to lead up to devolution and the debates about land reform, and then quickly through devolution as well. That if you go back, I'm going to take you back to the Assembly referendum in 78, but the year following that, in 1979, John McEwen published work, a lifetime of work for him on Who Owns Scotland. And that's the first time that we've seen a kind of systematic appraisal of who did own Scotland. And it was a very dramatic moment in wakening up the country to the ownership patterns that exist in Scotland. And these are highly unusual to most people, but we're probably largely unaware of that in Scotland, but very unusual internationally. And we have more concentrated land ownership than is the norm in most places. And that was the first systematic look at that, and it highlighted these matters, and it then also revealed, in a sense, the economic and social consequences that flow from concentrated ownership, concentrated wealth, concentrated power, concentrated influence in very few hands, and a power imbalance, if you like, in society. Now, that's contested territory. People will contest that. But that was the kind of view that was emerging from that piece of work. There then followed in the 1990s, I guess, and Andy was part of this, the McEwen Lectures, a series of lectures leading up to devolution in 1999 from a number of professors and eminent people talking about the impact of the concentration of land ownership in Scotland on a whole variety of questions, economic questions, rural development questions, and so on. Donald Dewar gave, I think, the last of those lectures in 1998 as the then Secretary of State and about to, as we now know, become the First Minister of Scotland. And he set out in that lecture, one, his enthusiasm for land reform as being a great early opportunity for the Scottish Parliament. It would have the time to legislate for the first time, and it would have the inclination to legislate, because the then Labour government, under his leadership in Scotland, was preparing some work on that. And he also, in a sense, alluded to the Parliament here not being subject to the will of the House of Lords, which many would have had maintained or helped maintain the current land ownership patterns that we had. And I guess in those years too, you had things happening like the Ascent Crofters buyout, which was really inspirational. It inspired a lot of people in Scotland, drew a huge amount of interest, but quickly followed by the Egg land buyout, again inspiring people and driving people into debate about these things. Things like the Lagan community doing the first of the big forestry leasing schemes to try and get more local control. And over that last year before devolution started, there was the Land Policy Review Group that was underway, chaired by the then Rural Affairs Minister in the Scottish office. And if I can quote from that paper when it came out, if I can just quickly, that in the third sentence of the final document it said, and I quote, "We need to put in place new and innovative means to properly securing the public interest in land use and land ownership." And I stress the question, the public interest in land use and land ownership. So that was right up front from the beginning. The first major recommendation they made to achieve that public interest, you had to increase diversity in the way land is owned and used, which will lead to less concentration of ownership and management in a limited number of hands. And of course, much land use is determined by ownership in the first instance. So that's a deep background. Come to this bill, and you've got the Scottish Government's policy memorandum stating the Scottish Government defines land reform as an ongoing process by which the ownership of land, its distribution, and the law which governs it is modified, etc. So, right at the heart of thinking over the 25-year period between different administrations is the concept of the public interest in land being important, and of concentration of land being an issue for Scotland that needed to be tackled. So 25 years of consistent policy towards that, and yet here we are 25 years later, and virtually nothing has changed in terms of the concentration and the patterns of ownership. And that, in a sense, is what this bill sets out to begin to take the next step on. One of the things Donald Dewar said in that lecture I mentioned was that he saw this as a long-term project. Land reform wasn't a single one-off event. It was going to be returned to by parliaments in the future until it made the kind of progress that it wanted to make. And this bill purports to deal with ownership, public interest and land use questions, but as it's drafted, it doesn't materially affect any of that, I would argue. And I can go into the detail of that when you want me to.
Okay. Laurie.
Great, thanks very much, Convener, and to the committee for inviting me today. I certainly do think that Scotland needs more land reform. As Peter's already pointed out, the Scottish Government's own definition of land reform is that it's an ongoing process, particularly focused on looking at the ownership of land, its distribution and the governance in terms of modifying, reforming and modernising it. And on this basis, I think it's clear we've still got some distance to go. Despite multiple rounds of land reform legislation in Scotland, which has seen some progress, many of the core issues that we have in Scotland remain stubbornly in place, whether that's in relation to the highly concentrated pattern of land ownership, which hasn't really shifted, indeed on some measures has potentially got worse over the past decade, whether it's in relation to the fact that Scotland's rural land market remains largely unregulated, where anyone can buy very large amounts of the country with few questions asked or consideration given to the public interest, or whether that's in relation to the fact that we've got an acute urban and rural housing crisis in Scotland, a large driver of which is a highly dysfunctional land market, or whether that's in relation to our ambition to deliver a just transition to net zero and meeting our climate, nature and biodiversity targets, again, all of which land is absolutely critical for. So does the bill meet the scale of the challenges? As currently drafted, I don't think it does. I think, for me, this is without doubt the weakest land reform bill that's been brought forward to this Parliament. There are some elements of the bill which I think are welcome, which we can get into around land management plans, deeper community engagement. I think some changes needed there, but certainly the right principles. But I do think that these measures really are tinkering around the edges and won't make a significant material change to the very core issues which I just outlined. And I would just echo what Peter said around public interest, because what's really been lost from this bill is any notion of the public interest. We did have the idea of a public interest test in the consultation, which I think had the seeds of being something that could be quite useful. That's been watered down completely and turned into this transfer and lotting mechanism, which was really only ever intended to be one potential outcome of a public interest test. And fundamentally, I think the issue, though, is that this bill has ended up being very narrow in scope, and there are just large things that are just completely missing. So there's very little, if nothing, on urban land reform or housing, for example, in relation to strengthening the land rights and responsibility statement or putting that on a statutory footing is missing, around conditions to public funding for land-based activity. And I think the elephant in the room in land reform continues to be in relation to tax and fiscal policy, which I think has a really, really crucial role to play in all of this, which, of course, both this bill and I think the Scottish Government widely has been fairly silent on. So, as currently drafted, I'd see the bill as a bit of a missed opportunity. And if we look at the Scottish Government's core objectives, whether that's in relation to land reform itself or wider objectives like economic growth, tackling the housing crisis, delivering a just transition or building community wealth, I don't think the bill as currently drafted is going to materially advance any of these. Thank you.
Thanks. Magnus, now's your moment.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, we can hear you perfectly.
I'm delighted. I've only got two qualifications. One, as a journalist, I've been covering land reform since the beginning of time. I was sitting in the Parliament watching the first bill as it progressed in 2003. But I'm also very much declare an interest. I'm a trustee of my wife's family estate in Perthshire, which is my late wife's family estate, which is 6,000 acres of heather and rock with a few sheep on it and a hydro scheme. And the question you ask is this bill needed? It depends what you mean. If the need is the political imperative of breaking up large acres of land and distributing it to local communities, then of course it's needed. That's always been the driving force behind land reform. But it runs into the barrier of what seems to me much more important, which is land use. And the point is that actually land use, in terms of delivering jobs and economic improvement, ironically, is very often better done by large estates rather than small broken up estates. And there is an inherent contradiction. You chair a thing called the Net Zero Committee, which is presumably aimed, with climate change in mind, at ensuring that the large areas of rural Scotland do their best with carbon capture and to help mitigate climate change. And right across Scotland, the message is the larger the areas of land, the better equipped they are to achieve this. The RSPB itself says nature does better in these larger, more ecologically joined up places. I'm looking at my copy of The Times, my own newspaper, this morning, and there's a group has been formed in the west of Western Highlands by 4 landowners to create a huge area of land because they think they can achieve rewilding. I'm not a great believer in rewilding myself, but everybody seems to subscribe to it. Scotland's largest landowner, Anders Poulsen, who gets very little criticism from this government, is a rewilder, as I understand it. And here we are, this local community group has been formed, includes Forestry and Land Scotland, which is a government agency, and the Woodland Trust Scotland, a nature conservation charity. We, on our Perthshire estate, have been encouraged by Nature Scot, RSPB, all the agencies we consult, to join up with other estates to achieve greater biodiversity and conservation. So it seems to me that right at the heart of this bill, there is an inherent contradiction. What are we trying to achieve in terms of land use? And if what we're trying to achieve is a balance between agriculture and conservation, then actually, ironically, bigger is best.